This story begins at the estate of the Grand Duke of Krypton. Some girl knocked on the door saying she was coming in. As she entered, she introduced herself as Mirabelle, a private mercenary, and said that she was willing to offer her services to the Duke. The Duke, sitting in despair, said that Mirabelle's fame precedes her, and he has heard that she does not tolerate failure on missions. Although he had also heard that she didn't usually take orders like this, and he handed her a picture of his daughter Cornelia and told her that it was very important to him and he was asking for her help. Mirabelle was very much surprised at such a task. Apparently the Duke really didn't know anything. Mirabelle hadn't heard that name in years after Cornelia ran away from home in pursuit of love. She often apologized by sending letters to her family. Even during her severe illness she wrote to them. But there was no reply. Soon she passed away. Was it after that he decided to find her? Mirabelle was infuriated by this fact, and she wondered if he was even going to look for her. The Duke asked in puzzlement what Mirabelle was talking about, and wondered why he never answered the letters. But the Duke was not aware that Cornelia had sent any letters. Then Mirabelle said she was sorry, and that Cornelia Krypton was dead. She had been sending letters for years, asking for forgiveness, and had died without ever receiving a reply. Duke didn't believe it at first. He didn't understand how she could be dead. At that moment, a mysterious man entered the room and said that they had finally met. But the Duke knew the man and asked what he was doing here. His name was Daniel. Daniel lit a cigarette and said that he believed the Duke had not yet gotten to know Mirabelle properly. As he started to walk toward them, he told the Duke that he had a granddaughter and offered to take her in. But the Duke could not believe his ears. Mirabelle became very anxious, wanting to know who the man was. He smiled, adjusted his hat, and said that he was Mirabelle's great-uncle. Then he asked where they were, and whether Mirabelle had told the Duke about the letters from Cornelia. Mirabelle was greatly angered by the fact that the man knew about the letters, and she wanted to know how he had gotten that information. The man was amused by this. He said he was intercepting them just to make sure his brother wouldn't forgive her, or it would ruin his plan. Then Mirabelle realized that the Duke wasn't ignoring the letters from her mother. He just wasn't receiving them. Duke became very angry, clenching his fists. He wondered why his brother was only telling him about this now. No matter what his reason was, he still wouldn't forgive him. Then Daniel drew his sword and said he was going to take her out of her life. But Mirabelle wasn't about to give up. She drew her dagger and was ready to fight back. Daniel was amused by that fact. He said she shouldn't fight back, and it would be best if she just accepted her fate. So it might be easier for her. Duke didn't want her to fight for him and told her to run away immediately. Mirabelle wondered if the Duke loved her mother, and she asked him about it, to which he said that she was everything to him, and he never held a grudge against her. Mirabelle had enough of those words to stay and protect the Duke. But this time she failed, and was impaled with a sword. At that moment, bleeding, she realized that this was her end, and she would never be able to avenge her mother. Bleeding, her body grew heavier and heavier, as if she were drowning. She had never been afraid of death, but she was very much afraid of not avenging her mom. In her last breath, she dreamed of one more chance. How suddenly, after a moment, she wakes up in the room, and when she opens her eyes, she sees her mom. She couldn't understand what was happening, but she immediately rushed to hug her, saying that she missed her very much. Her mother, confused, asked if she had had a nightmare, because she didn't understand what had happened. Mirabelle cried with happiness. Everything was so familiar to her, but something was wrong. When she looked at her hands first, she realized that they were too small, and something was wrong. Suspecting something wrong, she went to the mirror and looked in it. When she saw herself as a little girl, she was shocked. She asked her mom how old she was. Mom was a little confused because Mirabelle had just turned 9 years old yesterday. She was a little confused, so she went to breakfast. While she ate, she pondered everything that had happened. She was pretty sure she was dead, but for some unknown reason she had returned to the body of her 9-year-old self when her mom was still alive. She wanted to know who had brought her back to the past. But the most important thing was that she had been given another chance, and this time she had to find a cure for her mother. because she was only a few months away from her death. In a past life, she had to watch her mom die and there was nothing she could do. But this time, it was going to be different. But she was also even more eager to avenge her mother. But now her goal had changed. When the Duke asked her to find his daughter, he meant it. She realized that that man had deceived all three of them, and he was the reason everyone was victimized. She decides it's time for revenge and to change her future. But right now the main goal in her life is to cure her mom, and after that do justice to Daniel. But that meant she had to meet the Duke. And then a plan occurred to her. She asked her mother if she was busy today. When her mom said she wanted to stay home, Mirabelle asked about her grandfather and asked to meet him today. Mom got very upset and turned to Mirabelle and said she thought it was impossible, because once long ago she had done something he could never forgive her for. Mirabelle realized that her mother would not help her, and she had to go it alone. She had a schedule of caravans traveling to the capital. All she had to do was slip in unnoticed. But after her mom died, she had to live on the street, begging and avoiding other homeless people. So it wasn't that hard to get around unnoticed. Noticing a caravan coming, she quickly jumped in, throwing a white cloth over herself in hopes that she couldn't be spotted. Security was watching. The caravan couldn't find anyone there. Mirabelle immediately rejoiced, but suddenly she noticed a strange rustling and realized that someone else was there. It was a blonde-haired boy, but she recognized him, but didn't give him any sign. She asked what he was doing here and asked him to introduce himself. He smiled and said his name was Jeffrey Coleman. He was the most famous mercenary on the continent. They said the unit he founded was on the level of the Order of Ryan, a unit of royal knights. Plus, because of his influence, he was able to obtain the title of Mercenary King. He was also not only strong, but also cared for others, and was renowned for his reliability. Mirabelle remembered that when she had been a mercenary, he had wanted her to join his squad very badly. Then the guy wanted to know the girl's name, so she introduced herself as Mirabelle Hale. It was the name her parents had given her, and it suited her perfectly. The guy liked her name a lot, and asked her why she was hiding in the caravan, but it was the same question she wanted to ask him, the future king of mercenaries. And then she said she had to go to the capital, but the family had no free carriage, and asked what the lad was doing here. Jeffrey said he was being chased by the guards and needed a place to hide. Mirabelle was surprised and asked how such a small boy could be chased by guards. Jeffrey got angry and said that he had noticed that Mirabelle was clearly younger than he was. Then she realized that he was 2 years older than she was, and she had completely forgotten that she wasn't 26 anymore, and she apologized to him for her words. Then Jeffrey said that he had actually killed someone, and began to tell a story about a man named Guyman from Sharon Manor. He said his parents had borrowed money from him, but they could not pay it back, causing him to beat them to death. Jeffrey told the guards asking for help, but they blamed him and his parents, saying he shouldn't have borrowed the money in the first place. But the guards immediately reported to Guimon that Jeffrey had complained to them. Then he was furious, for he took pity on his little asterisk, and that's how he repaid him. So he decided to send the boy to his parents. But Jeffrey said he took matters into his own hands and was able to handle it. Mirabelle apologized, thinking it was a sore subject for him, but he said it was okay, because he had his revenge. And then Jeffrey asked what Mirabelle was going to the capital for. She told him that she wanted to meet her mother's father, that is, her grandfather. Jeffrey asked if her mom knew about it, but Mirabelle proudly mentioned that she hadn't even asked permission. Jeffrey, upon hearing this, became worried, saying that she should come back immediately, because she had no idea how worried her mom would be. Mirabelle knew that, but she couldn't afford to lose her a second time. She couldn't just let her go, so she was sure of her actions. She told Jeffrey that it was very important to her and that she would stay. He said, "If you are so important to her, then it's no big deal." Well, asked her to be careful and get to the capital in one piece, and she was relieved that he was worried about her. She patted him on the head, thanking him for his understanding. At that moment, Jeffrey grimaced at the pain in his stomach and fell to the floor. Mirabelle realized that he was hungry and probably had been hungry all along. She had some food, but she wanted to save it for the road. But since Jeffrey was so bad, she gave it to him. Before he took it, he was worried about what Mirabelle would eat. but she said she had taken 3 more of them. He shouldn't worry and had better eat as soon as possible. There was a long journey ahead. If the future didn't change, Jeffrey was going to be a successful mercenary. But that meant he wouldn't sleep at night and would starve. So she was glad he could eat and sleep now. It was a very powerful thing for Jeffrey to do, for they had never done such a thing for him before. He let out a little tear and said he would definitely pay for those potatoes. Mirabelle reassured him by saying that it was just potatoes, not to worry too much. But Jeffrey said that his parents had had to borrow money from Gaimon because he was always complaining about hunger, and so he no longer wanted to go into debt for food, even if it cost him his life. He took Mirabelle's hand and said he would have starved to death if it hadn't been for her. She smiled sweetly and said she hoped he would repay her double in the future. 3 days later, they finally reached the capital. Jeffrey helped Mirabelle down from the caravan, and they were off and running in no time. When they had run far enough away, it was time to part ways. Jeffrey thanked her for everything and asked her to promise him that she would come home after she met her grandfather, because her mother would probably be worried by now. Mirabelle smiled and said it was about Jeffrey too, and told him to take care of himself, hoping they would meet again someday. Almost breaking up already, Jeffrey turned around and yelled out that he would really pay her for the potatoes and told her to wait. She smiled and told him not to forget the rest of the potatoes she had shared with him. Mirabelle didn't know where or how, but she was sure she would meet him again. But that meant I absolutely had to do what she had come to do. As she approached the palace guard, she apologized to him and asked to see Grand Duke Crichton. He was surprised that an ordinary girl dared such an act. He knew it was pointless to ask, but he asked what noble house the people were from. Mirabelle answered him that the peoples came from an ordinary family, but she needed to meet him very badly. But the guard hastened to disappoint her, saying that his lordship was very busy with affairs of state. They needed to arrange an appointment in advance. Suddenly, at the same moment, the Duke came up from behind and asked if there was any trouble. Mirabelle recognized his voice immediately. The guard immediately explained that this child wanted to meet the Duke, and he was just about to escort her back. The Duke thanked the guards for a good job and started to leave as Mirabelle suddenly realized that he had no choice and no time at all. She shouted back that her mother's name was Cornelia Crichton and she needed help. The exasperated Duke returned to the girl and asked if she knew whose name she had just spoken. Mirabelle replied that she knew she was the Duke's missing daughter and told him that her mother had told her everything, and they could meet if he wanted. Shouted that she lived in the village of Delphia and offered the Duke to get there in 3 days by wagon. But Mirabelle said they had to hurry, for her mother was now very ill, and asked the Duke to help her. Mirabelle cried hard. She was sure she would never cry again, but the thought that her mother might die shocked her. She was ready to kneel, but the Duke leaned over to her and said he would not keep her waiting. He told the guards that he wanted to know if the girl was telling the truth, and asked to change his schedule. Looking at Mirabelle, he asked her if she was tired and suggested they go and rest, saying they would go to the village as soon as they finished cooking. At dinner, the Duke told the girl that he might seem insincere, for he didn't even know where his daughter was now. But like any father, he wanted his children to be happy. And he's sure that's what Mirabelle's mom is praying for right now. Mirabelle was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that she was now sitting and enjoying a sumptuous meal while her ailing mother. But as she looked at the Duke's face, she realized that he still didn't seem to believe her. But that was understandable, since there had been a number of people recently claiming to know where his missing daughter was. And each such false visit tore his heart apart, and he was no longer able to trust people. But she noticed the sincerity in his words. Even though her mother gave up the Duke and his house to be with her father, the Duke still prays for her happiness. So she decided he was right, and her mother wouldn't want her to come home hungry and sick. So she decided to eat. Having finished their lunch, they were informed that the carriage was ready, and they both set off. On the way home, Mirabelle was surprised to find that the Grand Duke was much kinder than she had thought, and that even though he did not believe that Cornelia was her mother, he still decided to join the girl on the journey to her village. She had hated him all her life for not helping and abandoning her mother, but looking at him now, she realized that hatred was gone, and even felt a little sorry for him. After all, he had longed for her all his life and finally died the same day he learned of her death. When night fell, they decided to stop and build a fire. And the Duke said that he would be very happy if she really turned out to be his granddaughter. But he understood perfectly well that the girl had overheard the name somewhere and decided to use it. But he said he didn't blame her, and that he knew it all along. But he felt her desperation and her sincere desire to help her mother. But it was just Cornelia and her very name that hurt his heart year after year. And that none of this would have happened if he had listened to her then, and he had no one else to blame but himself and his greed. Even though Duke Righton didn't give details, Mirabelle still understood what it was about, for her mother was engaged to the current Emperor James Bassett Castro. However, she fell in love with her personal guard Gail Houston, and wished to annul her engagement to the Emperor in order to marry Gail. But her wish was not supported by anyone, and despairing, she ran away with her lover. But unfortunately, Mirabelle's father died in a battle with demons in the forest, and her mother raised her alone. She knew that if it hadn't been for Daniel's plot, her mother's letters would have reached the Grand Duke. When she saw that the Duke wasn't feeling well, she took his hand, comforting him. Then he told her not to worry and thanked her, and that even if it turned out that her mother was not Cornelia, he would be happy to help their family. Mirabelle wanted very badly to tell him that he was wrong, and she was the one he had been looking for all these years, and he would soon be able to see her, but she couldn't do it. At last they reached the house. It was a badly ruined building, and the Duke was surprised that the girl and her sick mother lived alone in the house. When Mirabelle entered the house, she shouted to her mom that she was back, and they rushed to hug her. Mommy cried hard and asked if Mirabelle could imagine how worried she was. Started asking her if she was okay and if she had hurt herself on something. She said she was fine, no need to worry. Suddenly the Duke saw her and dropped his cane. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was really his daughter. They both started crying. They were glad to see each other. The Duke couldn't believe that after all these years he had finally found his child. Cornelia was sorry, and she began to apologize to her father for her actions. Then the Duke asked why she was here alone and where Gail had gone, and Cornelia told him that he had died 4 years ago, defending the village from demons. The Duke clutched his head. He was ashamed that his daughter had suffered so long alone and in such a place. He asked if it was true that she was very ill, for Mirabelle had told him so. She replied that she was very ill, which made him angry, and he asked why she had not come to see him. Then Mirabelle got up from the table and said that her mother wanted very badly for the Duke to forgive her, and she had written many letters, but had never gotten any answers, and so she thought he was still resentful of her and couldn't come. Duke felt sorry for her. He said he had never received any letters and had no idea she had written to him. He said they had much more to discuss, but it would be better to return to the manor first. She thanked him and said she would pack her things now. Once outside, her mother called Mirabelle to her and asked her why she had brought her grandfather here. She was very pleased that she was worried about her. She was proud that she had raised a brave little girl, and apologized to her for having to take on such a burden. She asked her not to do anything so dangerous next time, because she had a duty of care to her. Mirabelle apologized and said she understood. Carrying the things into the carriage, the Duke asked Cornelia why she did not give them to the footman, to which she said that they were Gail's things, and she wished to carry them herself, and they were not so heavy. Duke nodded and said that if that was what she wanted to do, let her do it. Cornelia wanted her daughter to get close to her grandfather, so she asked to hold his hand, and Mirabelle addressed him as "Your Ladyship," much to Cornelia's dismay, for she was still "Your Ladyship" to him, not grandfather. Sitting in the carriage, the Duke thanked Mirabelle for what she had done. If it hadn't been for her, he would never have found Cornelia. Mirabelle replied to him that she didn't deserve it, and that if it weren't for his kindness, it wouldn't have happened. For from the very beginning the Grand Duke did not believe her. It was his kindness to a helpless Christian child that united them all. Mirabelle was glad he was able to keep kindness in his heart even after losing his daughter. She was sure he deserved better. For the next 3 days, Cornelia and the Duke told each other stories of what had happened to them over the years. About how she loved her husband, and how she blamed herself for running away from home. For his part, the Duke said he'd learned a lot over the years, that it was selfishness and greed that drove his decision at the time. He regretted it greatly, for because of this they had lost each other for many years. Upon arriving at the manor, Mirabelle realized she needed to change the future. The Duke would take care of her mother's illness, but she needed to deal with the rest. Upon their arrival, the man did not meet them. He asked if what was in the letter was true, and that they had been able to find Cornelia. He was very happy to find her. When he saw her, he asked her where she had been all this time and why she had not contacted him, because he was very worried. She apologized to him, but he was glad she was back. Asking who it was next to her, Cornelia said it was her daughter, and introduced him to Mirabelle as Uncle Brian, saying he was the Duke of House Crichton. He was very happy to meet her and told the girl to call him Uncle from now on. Then he told her he had a son about Mirabelle's age and called him here. His name was Elliot Crichton. After getting to know their cousin, they decided to go inside after a long drive to get some rest. The Duke leaned over to Mirabelle and apologized to her, asking if she could stay in Cornelia's room tonight, for the servants had not yet had time to prepare Mirabelle's room. But the girl replied that she did not mind. Mama suggested that Mirabelle sing a lullaby. Mirabelle looked around and thought that maybe she was wrong, because there were some nice people living in the Crichton house. After a little while, the Duke sent his daughter to a healer, asking what was happening to her, to which the healer replied that he would need about 3 months of therapy. The Duke was greatly disturbed, and asked after this period a complete cure could be expected, whereupon the healer consoled him, saying that there was no need to doubt, and after 3 months Cornelia would be fully recovered. However, the healer also wanted to examine Miss Mirabelle, for the disease was named Haziel and was a genetic disease, and they could not state whether the disease was passed on to the offspring. Then Cornelia asked the healer to look at Mirabelle, but Mirabelle had no illnesses in her past life. Taking her hand, the healer was greatly surprised and said that Mirabelle showed no signs of illness and that she was, on the contrary, endowed with the ability to harness divine power. Then he suggested that she visit their temple, for she had a gift for divine power and could help many people. Apparently something had changed in Mirabelle the night she died. Nothing like that. And she asked if that meant she could cure her mother's illness. The healer smiled and said that her mother's illness was very ancient and complicated, but one day after the teachings, Mirabelle would be able to cure it. Mirabelle was beginning to wish she had this ability sooner, for then she would never have let her mother die so helplessly. But since she has this ability, she has now decided that she must do her best to learn how to heal people, and said that she would definitely visit the temple. Afterwards, they went to dinner and began to discuss their joy that the disease was curable. But most of all, the Duke was proud of his granddaughter, who had gone to the capital and managed to find him despite the danger. Sitting at the table, Mirabelle was glad to hear such warm words, but it was Elliot's gaze that confused her the most. She couldn't understand why he was staring at her so intensely. At this point, her uncle asked her how she slept, to which she said it was fine. He asked her to come to him if anything was wrong. She was very embarrassed, for in her old life, Brian was known as the Iron Duke, stale and indifferent. But worst of all, during the demon extermination expedition, she'd seen his eyes thirsty for blood. Mirabelle continued to be heaped with praise at the table, unable to understand how such a little girl was able to make it all the way to the mansion on her own. Brian said he wasn't just talking about it because she was his niece, although he would love to brag to everyone about what an incredible niece he has. Then he asked her if it was hard for her to relate to him, since she didn't even know she had an uncle. It must have been so frightening and unexpected. He apologized, because even the children in his neighborhood would run away in fear when they saw him. He's trying his best to be friendly, but apparently it's not working. He just said he wanted her to know that he was really trying to be kind. Mirabelle calmed him down, telling him that he had nothing to apologize for, and that it wasn't about his face. He just needed to work on his emotions. They began to worry, since Mirabelle hadn't eaten anything. But she assured them that everything was fine, and it would just take time to settle in and get used to everything. Then Uncle Brian said that if anyone would offend Mirabelle, she should go to him, and learning for that person would be worse than death, he assured her. Then the Duke asked if Mirabelle wanted anything else, for he had never had a chance to pamper his dear granddaughter, and that he had missed a lot and didn't know where to start. So he asked her to tell him what she dreamed of. She began to think, because her mom's illness would soon pass, and it was too soon to tell about Daniel. So she thought it would be nice if she could help Jeffrey. She realized that he would become a mercenary king on his own. But she didn't want that fate for him in this life, and decided that if she helped him now, he could repay it in the future. So she began to tell the Duke that there was a boy she had met on her way to the estate, though only briefly, but they had grown close over conversation. And it seems that he is being stalked. So she asked the Duke to help him. Duke said he would definitely do it. But to do so, he would need to know his name or any data that would help him find him. She said his name was Jeffrey Coleman. He was only 2 years older than she was, and that he had silver hair and blue eyes. The Duke was surprised that a boy of such a young age was already wanted, and thought it was some misunderstanding or misfortune, and promised to look into the matter. The Duke also added that he had received a letter from the Emperor yesterday, and that by some miracle he had heard of Cornelia's return, and had asked to visit him as soon as possible. This was the same Emperor who had suffered a terrible humiliation because of Cornelia, and she decided she should pay him a visit. Cornelia then proceeded to apologize to her own, and said she was sorry for the suffering her family had to go through because of her. But everyone was only glad she was back safe and sound, and said no apology was needed. Then Brian offered to accompany her on her visit to the Emperor. But Cornelia rejected his offer, saying it should be just between them. As soon as Mirabelle said she liked the cakes, the Duke immediately called the servants and told them to carry more, saying that he would give for Mirabelle whatever she wished. A little later, Mirabelle sat on her bed, glad that she had succeeded and that her mother was alive. But if she could go back further in time, maybe she could save her father too. Then her mom suggested that she meet the Emperor with her. Mom said that the truth was she was a little scared, even though she had told Brian that everything was fine. But with Mirabelle with her, she would be much more at ease. Mirabelle was too young to do anything when her father died, so she decided that from then on she would do anything to take care of her mom and protect her. The next day they arrived at the Emperor's house, where they received a warm welcome. An old acquaintance of Cornelia's met them. It was an old friend of hers, but he was now in command of the royal guard and offered to escort Cornelia, saying that His Majesty was expecting her. When he entered the room where the Emperor was standing, he said that he was upset about being late and that he was still in that garden waiting for her. Both then and now, he asked her why she had not visited him at least once, but she said that if she had met him in that garden, she would never have been able to see Gale then, and that she did not regret her decision. The Emperor noticed the girl, asked Cornelia, and if it was her daughter, and said that this time the conversation was not for children, they should talk in private. When her mother asked Mirabelle to take a walk outside. As she left the room, she ran into a boy. It was Prince Adrian Castro. He asked who she was and told her to be glad he wasn't hurt. She bowed before him and introduced herself as Mirabelle. The maid leaned toward the boy and said she was the granddaughter of the Grand Duke Cheriton. Then the boy was surprised that House Crichton had another child besides Elliot. Mirabelle apologized again for bumping into him and said she was relieved he wasn't hurt. Then the guy asked who was in the room with the Emperor now. Mirabelle asked what was wrong, and the lad said that the man who had made the Empress cry was in that room now, and that for her sake he would teach him a lesson. Realizing how he felt, and the temperature is now with his old love outside the door, and that this is a nightmare for the Empress, the boy, seeing his mother's tears, came running to help. She knew the feeling, and she was sure he was a good son. Then she told him that her mother and the Emperor were talking outside the room, and that she had no intention of upsetting the Empress. At the same moment Adrian was called by the Empress. Seeing him in front of the Emperor's door, she was a little upset, for she had hoped that she would not find him here. Leaning over to the children, she told Adrian that he would only make life difficult for the Emperor and embarrass him. Adrian raised his fist in the air and said that he had come here because this man had upset her, and he did not forgive such things. Mom appreciated her son's concern, but told him it wasn't necessary and stroked his head. She was going to say that she was very saddened by the fact that. But suddenly she noticed that there was another girl standing with Adrian. Then Mirabelle introduced herself and said that she was the daughter of Cornelia Crichton and Gail Houston. The Empress asked the girl if she was waiting for the conversation to end, and suggested that she go and have tea with her, as it was more fun than just standing at the door. They set the table and began to drink tea and eat sweets. And then the Empress asked Mirabelle if she knew that they had been best friends with her mother, though she could not say for sure. After all, she wasn't sure if Cornelia still considered her friend. She was sure that if her mother saw the Empress, she would definitely. But before she could finish her thought, Cornelia came up behind her, asking Mirabelle what she was doing here. Noticing the Empress, Cornelia said hello, asking how she was doing. The angry Empress got up from the table and accused Cornelia of making 8 years of her life a living hell. The Empress continued, saying that the Emperor had been waiting for Cornelia all along, and she had just vaporized without sending a single word about whether she was alive or not. She started crying, and added that Cornelia had just vaporized on top of that. The boy immediately wanted to rush to hug his mother, but Mirabelle stopped him, realizing that they needed to figure it out for themselves. She could see in their eyes that all that anger and sadness were really signs that she was bored and worried. After which the Empress embraced Cornelia, saying that now, seeing that she was alive and well, she could not help feeling happy. Then they began to drink tea together. Noticing the rough hands, the Empress asked Cornelia what had happened and how she could let it happen. Cornelia answered that after Gail's death, she had to take over all the work, and all this manual labor was reflected in her hands. The Empress asked why the Grand Duke did not help her, since he loved her so much. She had written to him several times, but for some reason none of the letters had gotten through. And after she refused him, she felt that she couldn't just pick up and go home, thinking that her father would still reason with her for doing so. Then the Empress grabbed Cornelia's hand and asked her why she didn't write to her since they were friends. Cornelia smiled sweetly, and said it would have been too impudent of her. Listening to all this talk, Mirabelle realized why her mother and the Empress were such good friends. Empress Mariana had been secretly in love with the Emperor for a long time. The day she decided to give him up, her mother ran away with her father, leaving the Emperor alone and annulling the engagement. Then she decided to appeal to him by taking a seat. It was her dream. She loved him so much, but unfortunately for her, Emperor Castro kept waiting and loving her mother. It was because of this that they didn't consummate their marriage until 2 years after their engagement. The love she felt for the Emperor, and the care she had for her mother, and the resentment she felt turned into a mixture of terrible misery until Prince Hadrian was born. Then she glanced at Adrian, thinking that at least he had been born a good son. He noticed this, and asked why she was looking at him, thinking she didn't like the cookies. She answered him that she liked the cookies, but they were too sweet for her. The boy was surprised by this. He could not understand how one could not like sweets. Mirabelle decided not to continue this topic, as he was still a child. After finishing their tea party, they headed for the exit, where the Empress told Cornelia to come to the royal castle whenever she wanted, and that she would make her favorite tea. Cornelia smilingly replied that she would not be offended if she came too often. The meeting went well, and Mirabelle also said goodbye to everyone. She was pleased to see that her mother's health was improving, but it was time for her to get the evidence she needed on Daniel and find out what he was up to. As Cornelia sat in the carriage, she noticed that Mirabelle was thinking about something and decided to ask her if she was well. Mirabelle said she wanted to ask her something, wondering if there was someone else in the Grand Duke's family that she had not met yet. Then Cornelia said that there was a great-uncle and father's younger brother, Daniel Crichton. Mirabelle looked at the look on her mother's face and decided that her mother didn't suspect Daniel of intercepting the letters. She had to prove it somehow. Just then, Mama decided to ask Mirabelle for a favor, to call Duke Crichton grandfather. She said he might not show it, but she was sure he really wanted Mirabelle to call him that. After all, he was her grandfather. She was a little embarrassed, but her mother was right. He was her mom's dad and her grandfather, and she decided to do it for her mom. When they arrived at the castle, They were immediately met by the Grand Duke, who asked how the meeting had gone. Cornelia replied that it had gone well, and then the Duke asked what they had talked about. Cornelia said that they had talked about what had happened in the past, how they had felt then, and His Majesty had been sympathetic, so there was no point in the Duke worrying. He was very happy, and said he could finally relax. Cornelia asked her father if she could go rest a little. For last year Uncle Daniel had promised to return, and until then she wanted to relax. To which the Duke said that there was no problem, and she could go rest in peace. Then Mirabelle decided that she should talk to her grandfather alone, and asked her mother to go and rest, for she had something to ask him. Her mother was worried, but the Duke believed that everything would be all right, and soon he would send Mirabelle to her. He was very interested in what she wanted to talk about. They went to the waiting room to have some tea and discuss it all. It was the same room in which Mirabelle had died. When Grandpa started to drink his tea, he asked what Mirabelle wanted to talk to him about. Mirabelle asked him if he remembered what she had said about the letters his mother had written him. He said he remembered, and Mirabelle said that it was about Cornelia's apology. Then Mirabelle said that his mom sent at least 2 letters a week, some of them sent through the Merchants Guild and some through Mercenaries. There must have been at least 20 a year, and she decided to say that none of them had reached her grandfather. But then she realized that he was unlikely to believe anything she said, especially that his own brother had intercepted all those letters. All she had to do now was arouse suspicion. Then she decided to tell him that she was a little afraid that these letters might have been lost because someone disliked her or her mother. The Duke coughed and thought it was strange indeed that so many letters had been lost. However, he assured Mirabelle that she had nothing to worry about, and no one in the mansion wished to harm her or her mother. She realized there was no point in telling him her story from the future, so she decided to ask him to handle the situation as her granddaughter, thanked him for listening, and went to rest. As she walked down the corridors, she began to wonder who else might be Daniel's accomplice. It was hard to imagine Brian as his accomplice, since he was the heir to House Cretan, entitled to all the inheritance and wealth. There would be no point in siding with Daniel. He would gain nothing from it, only lose. Besides, Brian was on good terms with the Duke, and it would be more logical to assume that Daniel acted secretly, so no one could notice his actions, and it is unlikely that he has accomplices here. But for now, that's just speculation. At the same time, Daniel entered the building as the butler was taking off his coat. He pointed his finger at the girl and didn't ask him who it was. Well, the butler told him it was Cornelia Crichton's daughter. Daniel said he knew Cornelia was back, but he didn't know she had a daughter. Mirabelle was sure he was a liar, because he must have known everything from those letters. Every breath he took was filled with lies. When she approached him, he told her he was very pleased to meet her, and introduced himself as her great-uncle, asking her to come closer so he could get a closer look at her. But Mirabelle wouldn't budge. Then he came up himself, thinking she was shy. He said he thought she should get used to him in time. Then the butler said it had only been a day since the little lady had arrived at the mansion, and that she still needed time to adjust. When Daniel asked the girl to tell her name, introducing himself as her grandfather's brother, Daniel called his name Daniel Cretan. Looking at all this, Mirabelle noticed that he was smiling like any good-hearted old man, and that if it weren't for the situation in the past and the cruelty she had experienced, she would have fallen for it. He disarms people with his charm, and that's probably why no one even suspects him. Then she decided to pretend to be an innocent child, and asked in a shaky voice if you were my great-uncle. Then Daniel said she shouldn't be afraid, and Mirabelle told him her name. He said he was very pleased to meet her, and began to reach out to Mirabelle, but she was very wary of it. The mere thought of him touching her instinctively made her pull back. Then he said that he would take his time to get to know her, because now they would see each other much more often, and asked her if she had seen her grandfather, because he had to meet him. When she said she knew where he was, he asked her to escort him, for it was very important to him. Then the butler shouted that Lord Daniel seemed to want to get to know the girl better. It scared her. She didn't know what he was up to, and she really didn't want to do it for him, but she couldn't refuse and didn't cause tension clenching in her hands. She said she would see him off and went straight to the walking down the hall. Daniel asked the butler. Why is Mirabelle acting like this? After all, he remembers Cornelia as a child, and she was always so outgoing. Maybe she's still getting used to her new surroundings? The butler replied that the girl needed more time to feel at home here. Then, having lost her beard, Danielle thought she had lived so long as a peasant, and now she found herself in a mansion, and it would take at least a few months to shake off the peasant sensibility. He also remarked that she had a very pleasant face, and with proper care she would have many admirers. And he was glad that her looks would not interfere with the search for a husband. It was hard for Mirabelle to hear these outrageous and humiliating things, but she had to remain calm, for she had to find the traitor who had been intercepting letters on Daniel's orders, and win the Grand Duke's trust with brine. It was the only way she could uncover Daniel's plans, get revenge, and make him pay for everything he'd done. She was sure she had plenty of time, nowhere to rush, and all she needed to do now was look for subtle hints or clues in his words. Daniel continued to ask the butler about various things, and then the subject came up of the Marquis of Bayev's son, who must now be about 16 years old. He thought that a marriage between their houses would strengthen House Critten's position among the nobility. House Grace would have welcomed Mirabelle with open arms just for her beauty, but that's why there were so many bad rumors about her. He didn't think she was the best candidate for matchmaking. He listed various names and surnames, and Mirabelle grew increasingly disgusted by it. She didn't understand how anyone could consider potential suitors for a 9-year-old girl based on status and wealth. It was just disgusting to her, but she had to hold back to gain her grandfather's trust. When Daniel said that Duke George would be perfect if it weren't for his age, Elliot interrupted him. He was greatly perturbed, for Mirabelle was only 9 years old, and as far as Elliot could remember, Duke George had no children. So he asked, "Is Danielle really considering Duke George as a potential suitor for Mirabelle?" As he stepped closer, he said that if Daniel couldn't remember his age, then Elliot would have to give him a cure for his memory loss. Daniel smirked and said that he didn't mean it, but only wanted the Duke's help in finding a suitable partner for Mirabelle, and that it hurt him to hear Elliot twist his words. Elliot then asked if Danielle would mind if he passed those words on to his father and the Grand Duke. Mirabelle was very surprised that Elliot would stand up for her, to which Danielle replied that Elliot could do as he pleased. Then he said he would, and asked why Mirabelle was acting as Daniel's guide, and Mirabelle told Elliot that he had asked her to take him to his grandfather. Elliot then said that the only one who needed to be escorted was Mirabelle. Taking Mirabelle by the hand, he said that her room was ready, and he would take her there, and that the butler was quite capable of handling taking him to the Duke's room. So he asked them to excuse him and left with Mirabelle. When he and Mirabelle arrived in her room, he asked if she liked it. It was hard to accept this new reality, but she liked having a nice and cozy bed. But she also liked that there was someone here who was willing to stand up for her, even though it made her a little uncomfortable. But it was nice nonetheless. Elliot, scratching his head, told Mirabelle to stay away from her great-uncle. Though it was his opinion, he was sure there was something wrong with him, and at least she should avoid dialogue in private. He said that in case of anything, the servants wouldn't be able to help her, so she should make sure she had someone with her when she was going to speak. He asked if she was frightened, and that he was sorry for what had happened. She assured him that everything was fine, but she did feel uncomfortable around him, and she thanked Elliot for standing up for her. Looking at him, she began to think that he, too, had been victimized by Daniel. But after all, he was the Duke's legitimate grandson, Brian's only son. She couldn't understand how it had happened, but she realized she was a child now, and could just ask that. Then she asked Elliot if Uncle Daniel had bullied him. Then he told her they were in the same boat, and Mirabelle realized it was about marriage. Elliot began to tell me that Uncle Daniel was very obsessed with the issue, as if he was trying to get rid of them. Then Mirabelle thought about the fact that she was an adult in a child's body, and because of that she could understand everything Daniel was saying. But if she were just a child, she wouldn't be able to understand half of what he was saying. Elliot began to tell her that he thought they should consider feelings, and Mirabelle seemed to think that Elliot was more mature than children his age. Sometimes he was even sharper. Then she asked him, Is there a girl he likes? He replied that yes, and she wondered who she was. He got a little nervous and said that her name was Zenial Saffron. The son became agitated. He said he had to go and quickly left the room. Mirabelle collapsed on her bed, happy for Elliot. For she had once heard that the Lord of House Crichton and Dame Saffron had been married as soon as she stepped onto the threshold of Crichton Manor. The feeling of uneasiness never left her. But thanks to Elliot, it was much better. Now that she was rested, she decided it was time to think. Who but Daniel would intercept her mother's letters? This man was doing it without even consulting the Grand Duke, which meant it was quite a powerful man. All these details pointed her to only one person. It was the same butler, named Stuart, who was expecting Daniel's visit today. From the way they'd talked to Daniel, it seemed to her that they knew each other well. However, that wasn't enough to make him her prime suspect. So what if he's hosting? It's not strange that he works for Daniel. She also thought that he might not be the only one in cahoots with Daniel, and she should get to know the staff of the mansion better. In a way, she could even understand why Daniel would do such a thing, since her mother had broken off her engagement to the Emperor, while creating a giant rift between House Crichton and the royal family. Even if Daniel becomes Lord Crichton, the royal family will not interfere. However, she reflected on the fact that the relationship between Crichton and the Emperor might improve due to her mother's return, and one could not predict for sure, and that if he was going to take over, the royal family, would only get in his way. And perhaps that was the reason he was intercepting his mother's letters. However, her mother had already returned home and spoken to the Emperor. Mirabelle hoped that the thought would haunt Daniel at night, but she also realized that he wasn't the kind of man who would sit idly by, and perhaps he would try to get rid of the two of them under the pretext of goodwill. Two maids entered the Mirabelle's room. One introduced herself as Kalina Clovit, and the other as Anita Leopold, saying that the other would take care of her personally. Kalina will also be with Mirabelle, but Anita is a personal maid and will accompany her wherever she goes and keep her company. Mirabelle was glad to meet her. "Get out of your room." She made her way to the dining room, where Uncle Brian met her on the way. He offered to accompany her, thanking her for traveling with Cornelia to the royal castle, and asked if they were all right there. She was very surprised that a man who had destroyed many demons was having trouble talking to a little girl. Then she noticed the tears in his eyes, and asked why he was crying. He told her that he was very happy to have such a charming, sweet niece. It really turned her perception of Brian upside down. She now has a reliable family. After so many years of struggling alone, she finds everything is so much more beautiful than she ever expected. Brian then asked her if she could tell him if she had met anyone at the royal castle, and asked her to share the details, to which Mirabelle replied that she had met the Emperor. But he wanted to talk to her mom alone, so she had to leave. She also said that she met the prince and the empress, saying that she and her mom were good friends. Then she asked Brian if that was true. He told her that her mother had been friends since they were children, and that the empress had been more shocked than most when she learned of Cornelia's disappearance with Gale. Brian asked Mirabelle if the prince had been rude to her. She remembered how he had fallen to the floor and blamed her for it, but she decided not to talk about it, for he was a good son. Brian calmed down and said that if he ever disrespected Mirabelle to let her know immediately. After all, he happened to be his fencing coach, and he and Leoka would make him pay if he ever hurt Mirabelle. Mirabelle wondered what he was talking about, and Brian said he meant him the toughest work out of his life if he dared offend Mirabelle. He also told her that it didn't have to be a prince, and that if she was ever hurt by anyone, she should let him know if she needed his help. So she decided to ask him to teach her how to wield a sword. After all, her mercenary skills were just instinctive survival techniques that had become a habit. But if she trained with an artificial master like Brian, she might be able to reach even greater heights and even destroy all of Daniel's men. Brian was a little concerned and told her that it would be a little harder than she thought, and asked her if that was definitely what she wanted to do. He told her that even though he was her uncle, he wouldn't feel sorry for her while she was practicing, and she should think hard about it. To which she replied to him that it was all right, and she wanted to study. He told her that he would accept her request, and they would start studying from tomorrow at dawn, adding that she could let him know at any time if she wanted to stop. He told her he wasn't going to end it. He then patted her on the head, at which point he could see the pride in him. Having finished all this dialogue, they went to the dining hall, where they were already waiting, and the Duke seated Mirabelle near him. Despite the fact that this place was considered a place of honor, and Brian sat there all the time, Mirabelle hoped he would not take offense at that. The Duke looked at her and asked if she was tired after the royal visit, to which she told him that she had enjoyed everything there, and she was glad to have a cup of juice. The Duke was happy to hear that, and asked her to tell him if anything happened. After all, her grandfather would take care of everything. She was very embarrassed. This family appeared overprotective, but she had to be. Then Daniel said that his brother couldn't suddenly change his character just because he had a granddaughter, and people would be shocked to learn that the Grand Duke, known for his steadfastness, was shedding tears. Duke asked to be excused for not introducing them, but Daniel said they had already met. Then the Duke didn't understand when they'd had time, and he asked how it had happened, to which Elliot told him that upon Daniel's arrival he had asked Mirabelle to be his guide, a child who had only spent a day here and barely knew how it worked. Then Daniel decided to get out of it by saying he was so charmed when he first saw her that he decided to tease her by asking her to escort him, adding that she was very smart and knew the way perfectly. Anyway, the Duke asked Daniel to be more careful, since Mirabelle had only been here for 24 hours, and asked him to imagine how scared she would be if she got lost. Half an hour later, when all had been drunk, the Duke began to boast of his granddaughter, for, "I had her beyond her years." He could not imagine how the little girl had gotten here from Delphia on her own. You're a whole 3 days' drive there. He was very surprised that right before the mansion, she told him that Cornelia Harriton was her mother, and she was very sick, and that she was able to ask for help just like that. He thought it was a very brave thing to do. Look, all this Mirabelle realized, it wasn't about bravery, it was about determination, because she had made a vow to herself that she would never lose her mom again. Daniel raised his glass and said that one day Mirabelle would make an excellent Crichton, and with such nerves maybe she might well be suited to the role of head of the Grand Duchy of Crichton. The Duke liked the idea, of course. He needed to get to know her character better, but Mirabelle was already giving him high hopes. Mirabelle had never seen her grandfather so happy, but Daniel was only pretending, hiding his true evil nature. But the Duke trusted Daniel completely, though it was not surprising since they had lived together as a family all their lives. Suddenly, Daniel proposed a ball in honor of Cornelia and Mirabelle's return to high society. The Duke thought it was a good idea, but he wanted to know what his granddaughter and daughter thought and said that from now on it would be as they wished. Cornelia didn't mind the ball, but she was worried about Mirabelle, for she was a very sensitive girl. Mirabelle understood why her mother was hesitant, for as soon as word spread that they were back, many people would congratulate them and welcome them back. But there would be just as many who would gossip behind their backs, and that her mom felt very strongly that she might be hurt by those words, which was probably why Daniel had offered that score, and it seemed like he wanted to turn her into an obedient little puppet. Mirabelle would never grow up to be a mercenary if she was intimidated by someone else's words. So it's not going to be what Danielle thinks it will be, and she's happily agreed to this ball. But Cornelia didn't seem very eager to go to the ball, looking for excuses. Then Daniel said it would be a good experience for Mirabelle, and that he was sure word of Cornelia's return had already spread through the capital, and asked her to imagine what they would say if she didn't even show up. Then she decided that she would go to the ball, because such rumors did not only concern Cornelia, they could affect Mirabelle as well. After hearing all this, the Duke said he would order the servants to prepare a flawless ball for them. Even though Mirabelle knew it was a trap, she was still uneasy about going there. But she also felt that Daniel should not let his guard down, and promised that it would not be like last time. The next morning, Mirabelle went to the training room where she was to be taught by Brian Crichton himself. She was sure she would be much better after this training, and as a bonus, by spending more time with Brian and Elliot, she would be able to find out if they were allies or enemies. After all, Mom's letters were being intercepted by someone at the mansion, and if they turned out to be allies, she might be able to get them a little help. After greeting everyone, Brian told Mirabelle that today was her first day, so they would start with stretching, asking her not to overdo it, not to repeat after him and Elliot. He started stretching, talking about how it's the most important part of the workout. It helps to avoid unnecessary injuries. So, he said, it should never be forgotten, and it is best if Mirabelle stretches after the workout as well, and that from that point forward, every day she should do stretching before and after her workout. After they finished stretching, they decided to test her endurance by running one lap around the gym. Mirabelle couldn't run from her seat as fast as before. It wasn't surprising, since her body was untrained, and those skills were just memories in her head. After running a lap, she sat down to rest for a while. Brian leaned over to her and said that she was fast enough for a beginner. However, they had a lot of work ahead of them, and they would not start fencing until Mirabelle had enough stamina. She got very excited and said she would work on it. Then he said he would give her another assignment and sent them off to squat. Brian really wasn't kidding when he said he wouldn't spare Mirabelle in training. Very tired, Mirabelle collapsed on the floor, and Brian came over and said that they would repeat these exercises every morning to improve her stamina. But he thought it would be very hard for her. She knew that learning swordsmanship required basic stamina. Besides, Uncle Brian had spent his time and effort to train her personally, and she couldn't let him down, so she said she could do it. She bowed before him and thanked him for the lesson. He was proud of his niece and said she had done well. Going to lunch, Duke found out that Mirabelle had been at Brian's practice and asked if it had been difficult, but she said it was fine and really enjoyed it. Brian said he's sure it was very hard on her, especially since it was only the first day, but he's very glad she didn't give up, and maybe House Crichton will soon see another great fencer in its ranks. As suddenly Daniel entered the room and said that there was no need for the girl to learn how to wield a sword. The Duke then asked Daniel where he had been, to which he replied that he had some business to attend to. And Mirabelle asked what was wrong with a girl learning swordsmanship, for she knew many famous female knights, and from what she had heard, they had all started early. She knew she should have left it at that, but Daniel was getting on her nerves too much. Then the Duke had said that nothing was impossible, and that she should keep trying, but Daniel had laughed at the phrase. Mirabelle then asked him if he had never accomplished anything. He angrily asked what she was talking about, and she said that she had been told that people who belittle the efforts of others are most often people who have never achieved anything in their lives, and apologized, saying that she had not meant that he was such a person. She realized that Daniel wouldn't yell at the dinner table at a little girl while her grandfather watched, so she smiled and said that she understood that Daniel had only said that because he was worried about her, and thanked him for that. He smiled and said that it was exactly like that, and he was just worried for her safety, and that at these stages, he thought Mirabelle was more in need of etiquette lessons than fencing. He said she should learn good manners before she encounters other nobles, and from what he saw yesterday, she seems unfamiliar even with dinner manners. The Duke looked at his brother and realized that he was right. And while she was here, sooner or later, she would have to learn how to do this. He thought he was overdoing it, and he wanted her to be able to relax a bit, so he thought he had scheduled the ball too soon. Mirabelle, getting nervous, said it was fine. There's no need to cancel the ball, and she really likes to do things, not just sit around and relax. Then the Duke asked Cornelia if she wanted to choose suitable teachers for Mirabelle, or if he should do it himself. After which, Cornelia asked for a list and she would take care of everything, and said that she too would join in the training with Mirabelle, for it had been so long since she had been among you-know-what, and she was afraid she had forgotten everything. And then Cornelia remembered that Mirabelle had yet to visit the temple, and suggested that she go there today, for she would be too busy when she had a teacher. Mirabelle had been meaning to go there for a long time, so she decided to do it today, especially since she might actually be able to cure her mother's illness herself. Then Cornelia said that she would prepare a carriage for her after she had finished eating, and she was sure that she would have nothing more to do. As they left in the carriage for the temple, Mirabelle was asked by her mother if she was sure she wanted to learn fencing, for she wouldn't really want her daughter to know how to fight. Mirabelle then asked if it was because of Daddy or this. Mom was silent, her head cocked. Then she understood and grabbed her hand, telling her not to worry, promising that nothing like this would ever happen to them again. Gale Houston was a noble knight who had sacrificed in his life to save the village of Delphia. Mom was very worried that Mirabelle might end up like him. However, in order to protect her, Mirabelle was willing to do her best. Just as suddenly, Mirabelle spotted a guy outside the window who looked like Jeffrey, and flashed over to call out to him, but she was pushed away, telling him not to do so, that it was very dangerous. Mirabelle was sure she had definitely seen Jeffrey there, and decided that when she returned to the mansion, she would be sure to ask Grand Duke Crichton to find out how Jeffrey was doing now. Then her maid wanted to know who Jeffrey was, and Mirabelle gladly told her that he was a friend she had met on her way to the capital. The maid noticed how much Mirabelle wanted to say hello to him, and asked if she was all right, for she was ready to jump out of the window to see him. Mirabelle couldn't say her heart was broken, but merely that an opportunity had been missed, at the cost of 2 potatoes. Mirabelle finally arrived at the temple, and upon entering she was very excited, for the moment of truth had finally arrived, and today she would find out for sure if she would have enough divine power to heal her mother. At the entrance to the temple she was met by the priest, who said that he was very honored by her visit, and asked her to follow him. When she reached the huge gate, he said that only Miss Mirabelle could go through, and that the others would have to wait here. Mirabelle immediately asked what was inside, but the priest replied that she would only know when she went in. He told her that he, like all the other priests, had been through it, and that there was no need to be afraid. She was a little scared because it sounded like a trap, and she didn't want to go in there alone. When she looked at his gaze, which was so holy and pure that it was impossible to resist, she made the decision to enter that room. As she entered the room, the doors themselves closed behind her, and she began to suspect that perhaps this priest was one of Daniel's men and was only pretending to be a priest, and then everything would fall into place. Just as she decided to leave, a strange man with a staff came up behind her and told her not to be afraid. She turned around and asked him who he was, to which he replied that he was a humble servant of the goddess Duana named Pleon. He asked her to sit down, saying he had something to say as well, but his name sounded familiar to her. He said he suspected she knew who he was, and now it was obvious to him that she was the one he was looking for. Mirabelle said that everything sounded exactly as if she had been lured here on purpose, even with no apparent reason for it. And then she remembered that people didn't learn about Pleon until she was in her 20s. So perhaps he knew she came from a different time. He told her to sit down, realizing that she would have so many questions, and he would be happy to answer any of them. When she sat down, he asked her if she knew what awaited her in the future, for that was where she had come from. She confirmed that she had come from the future, but did not know her fate, to which the priest said that he had waited a long time for her arrival. She lowered her head and said she still didn't understand. After all, she has too little information. She knows how to sleep in the forest, how to take a wagon to the merchant guild without paying, but she doesn't understand what use she can make of this knowledge. She looked at him and said that if she was to play an important role in some massive plan using information from the future, it would be better if someone really worthwhile took her place rather than a former mercenary. Then he told her that the creature that brought her back in time had chosen her, and he held it out to her. He said that this noble being had brought her here. She didn't understand anything. She asked if the pendant had brought her back to the past, if she would recognize it if she kept it to herself. Looking at the pendant, she wondered why he kept referring to it as a creature or entity, because it all sounded a little strange, but apparently this trinket had indeed brought her back to the past. She asked him for more explanation, but before she could finish, she noticed that the priest had vanished, leaving only a trace of him on the bench, and she never saw him again. All of her next days were packed with classes and training. She would wake up in the morning going to training, followed by breakfast, and then etiquette and general education. Then she had courtesy lessons and dance lessons. It turns out that her mentor named Vicatessa Maynard had also been tutored by her mother when she was a child. Despite being in her 60s, her every gesture seemed honed, graceful, and flawless. She had created a curriculum that even someone as far removed from social etiquette as Mirabelle would be able to master in a short period of time. The teacher wanted to teach Mirabelle perfectly, but since the grand ball was only a day away, Her goal was to teach Mirabelle how to make simple conversation. She pelted Mirabelle mercilessly, but the latter could do nothing about it, for the principles of noble common knowledge of etiquette and all the rest were too difficult for her. The teacher said that no one would have high expectations for Mirabelle because of her young age, so she asked her not to panic and not to try to rush through the material at this point. It seemed to Mirabelle that politeness and dancing weren't such bad lessons. The teacher said that after the ball they could take a more reasonable pace, work the materials more thoroughly, and decided that class was over for the day. Mirabelle was very happy about this, for it meant freedom from the clutches of Madame Maynard's education. She wished it would all be over so she could keep track of what Danielle was doing now. But she also decided to take her time, as Madame Maynard had told her. After all, in a previous life, Daniel had made his move after 14 years. It is already some time before the worst possible outcome happens. She was sure that the Grand Duke himself would intervene if anything happened to her mother. The priest also said that the pendant was hers, but she still did not dare to wear it, because everything about it in that day seemed to her very unusual. She couldn't put it off any longer and decided to see it through, sitting on the bed looking at her pendant. She decided that she shouldn't be surprised, but it was still a plain silver pendant with wings. As she looked at it, she started to think it was just ordinary, but she noticed that the snake's eyes opened, and because she was 100% sure that as soon as she got it, the snake's eyes were closed. Suddenly, she noticed that the snake on the pendant had begun to blink, as if it were alive. The snake was looking at her as if it were something unusual here, and she was very frightened by it. Suddenly the pendant spoke to her, telling her that he was the dragon guardian of the goddess Duana, Ana Vivre. She had heard that name before, a guardian in the guise of a snake, serving as the arms and legs of goddess Duana, a long white body with huge translucent wings and piercing ruby eyes. She smiled and asked if he was definitely the dragon guardian of the goddess Duana, and why he looked like a snake now. To which he replied that he had his reasons. After his battle with the black dragon, he found himself trapped inside the pendant. It was the only appearance he could manifest in with his current powers, and that Mirabelle should believe him. Mirabelle began to wonder if he was telling her the truth, for it seemed to her a delusion to be fighting a black dragon. But remembering the words of Saint Pleon, who called the pendant a living thing, and the fact that she had gone back in time, was proof enough of the existence of incredible phenomena. It no longer mattered to her whether this creature was a worm or something else. If this artifact actually needed her, well, at least it wouldn't do her any harm. She said she believed Vivre and asked why Saint Pleon had given him to her, adding, however, that he had said Vivre could answer all her questions. Weaver said he had the answers to all her questions, even about the reason she went back in time after she was killed, namely because there were still traces of the black dragon clips in the past. Mirabelle said she had never met him before, and Weaver told her that she had died before Calypso was reborn. However, she had been killed by someone under its influence, and that trace of the black dragon remained in her. But she couldn't exactly believe this dragon. The only thing she was sure of was that Daniel was going to take over the duchy. But you can't just say that he sold his soul to the black dragon to gain control of the Grand Duke. That sounds absurd. Besides, even if someone is under the black dragon's control and killed her, it doesn't explain the fact of how she ended up in the past. Otherwise, everyone who was killed by his hands would have gone back in time as well. To which Weaver told her that it wasn't Clips's powers that revived her. It was he who brought her back to the past. More specifically, he and Pleon. Weaver asked if Mirabelle knew that Pleon was a saint, and also that Calypso controlled Daniel. The Wyvern said that Pleon had been just as summoned to help prevent the resurrection of Calypso, and the Wyvern gave him the power he used to seek out those under the Black Dragon's influence. However, their power was not enough to defeat Daniel, and they couldn't win, and the Clip was reborn. Then Pleon decided that this task would be suitable for someone else, and he found the Mirabelle. Eventually, he sealed the Wyvern in this pendant, and went back in time to find the Mirabelle. Pleon had been waiting for Mirabelle at the temple for years, and finally she visited him. and as soon as he handed over the pendant in which Weaver was sealed, his part of the job was over. Mirabelle realized that the ash that was left behind him on the bench was all that was left after the Pleon died. Mirabelle asked, exasperated, if the dragon had sent her back to the past just because of the black dragon, to which the worm replied that she had. He and Plune chose her and were sure she would be the one to carry on his legacy. Mirabelle apologized and said that she could not kill this dragon and that the dragon should have chosen someone stronger and more experienced in this matter. And then the dragon, smiling, said that he was relieved that he was not asking her to kill this black dragon, for dragons cannot be killed. All that was left for Mirabelle was to simply trap him and put him into an eternal sleep. He said he needed Mirabelle to keep the shackles of the Clipsu from breaking. Mirabelle said that no matter what he called it, she would have to fight this dragon anyway, and no matter how one looked at it, it was an impossible request. But the worm said that she wouldn't have to fight the dragon, only to prevent it from being reborn. She said that even though she wouldn't have to fight him, the task was still difficult, and since he was the one who had sent her back in time, he must know she was a mercenary. And she said that she had only one rule. She would only take a job if she was offered decent pay. So in exchange for the black dragon's help, she wanted something too. Then the wyvern told her that if she successfully prevented Clips's resurrection, the Duan Temple would successfully present her as a saint and grant her all the benefits associated with that title. But Mirabelle said that wasn't what it was about at all, and then the wyvern asked what else was needed. Mirabelle asked the wyvern again if he had said that Danielle was trying to break the shackles of the clipboard, which meant that the wyvern must have proof of their bond. If that was the case, he should share all the information with her down to the smallest detail. She knew it was an almost impossible task, but it could be the perfect opportunity for her, because in 11 years, Daniel would try to usurp the House of Curtin, and she only has 3 years left before she's considered an adult, and it won't be easy for her to stand in the way of someone who is trusted by everyone in the family. However, if she gets more information, she might be able to prove Daniel's connection to the Black Dragon and convince the others. Dragon said he understood what she was trying to accomplish, but however, all he knew about Daniel was only that he was trying to break the shackles holding the clip back. Many people have the same goal, and Daniel Curtin is their centerpiece. The dragon said he was sorry, for Mirabelle must have had such high hopes for him. However, that was all he knew. But Mirabelle was horrified, for the dragon had said he had seen the past, seen himself, as if he had all the information in the world, and now he was telling her he knew everything except what really mattered. She couldn't believe that was all, for how could she stop Daniel without knowing anything? And then the dragon offered to give her power. Mirabelle immediately wondered what kind of power she was talking about, and the dragon said that he could give a power that could stand up to those under the Black Dragon's control. A divine power. Mirabelle was immediately interested. After all, if this was really true, and this dragon could give her divine power, it would help her a lot to stop Daniel. Not to mention the fact that she owed it to Pleon and the worm for bringing her back in time so she could save her mother. Then she decided to ask him one last time. He wanted her to destroy Daniel before he could revive the Black Dragon, to which he answered her. Yes, it was her duty to stop Daniel Curtin. She said she would help Vivre. He didn't believe it at first, but when she said that if there was a Gola she could just return him to the temple, he became convinced of the honesty of her words, whereupon Mirabelle asked, "Exactly what power will Weaver give her?" He promised to give her 2 kinds of power. One she already knew, a divine power that could only be used by priests blessed by the goddess Duana herself. As soon as he began to speak of the second power, the amulet shone with a bright light, and a golden sword emerged from it. It was a sword made from one of the bones of a vivra, a lepidus. Mirabelle was pleased at first, and then asked Vivre if it was okay for him to live without a bone, and offered to give the sword back to him. He told her that he was a dragon guard, and for decades that sword had been passed down to those who agreed to confront the Clipper with it. It was a powerful weapon against the dark forces that the Clips used to control their subordinates. It manifested only when she wished it to, and disappeared as soon as it was no longer needed. Mirabelle, hearing this, wondered how it worked, and decided to check it out, since she didn't need the sword right now. When she thought about it, it disappeared from her hands. Viv said that this sword was one of a kind, so he asked her to be very careful with it. Besides, anyone under the influence of the clip would immediately recognize this sword. So he asked Mirabelle to use it only when necessary, and she promised him to remember this information. When she wished the sword was in her hands again and took a few strokes to make up for it, it had been so long since she had held a sword in her hands that she thought she wouldn't remember how to do it at all. But now that she had a sword that she really liked, she really wanted to wave it around a bit. She also felt the power inside her chest to heal her mother. She was sure she could defeat Daniel and prevent the resurrection of Calypso, protecting her family once and for all. The next morning she was wearing a ball gown being tried on. Elliot was standing on the way out, offering to escort Isabel. Having said that, one would normally have to be a royal princess at her age to be honored with such a debut, since the only other person besides a princess in this kingdom with a high enough status would be the child of the Grand Duke, Crichton, in other words, her. She asked if that was true, and Elliot told her that it only proved how much influence House Crichton had in the kingdom of Mirabelle. It was no surprise that Daniel was eager to lead it, but she wondered if he needed the power of House Crichton to resurrect the Black Dragon, or he simply needed authority and wealth, or perhaps there was a connection between the resurrection of Calypsis and the resources of House Crichton. Elliot thought that Mirabelle was nervous and reassured her, telling her that she had nothing to worry about, because even if she failed, no one would dare criticize her, but he was sure that everything would go well. She realized that he was trying to calm her down because he thought she was nervous about the ball, so she thanked him and told him that he helped her calm down. Whereupon he held out his hand to her and asked, "My dear lady, will you take my hand?" She answered him that she would be glad to, and they went into the room where the ball was being held. As soon as they entered, their names were immediately shouted throughout the hall. The family immediately greeted them and praised them for their outfits. Then the Duke invited Mirabelle to go with him and greet their guests. She gladly accepted. Approaching the guests, the Duke began to push his speech. "My lords and my ladies, welcome. I am Alexander Crichton, Lord and Grand Duke of House Crichton." He thanked everyone for joining them on this beautiful evening, and introduced his favorite daughter, Cornelia Crichton, and also did not forget about Mirabelle, his favorite granddaughter, who was dearer to him than life at that moment. The audience clapped and congratulated him. After all, he had not seen his family for many years, and finally was able to reunite with them. Everyone in the hall was sure that this was a big celebration for the Duke. He thanked everyone for those warm words and again thanked everyone who joined them for this night of celebration and giving back. Cornelia and Mirabelle told everyone to enjoy this night to the fullest. So many people had come to the ball that Mirabelle felt more comfortable surrounded by angry demons than she did here. At the same moment, the Empress and her Adrian Costro joined the ball. Mirabelle hadn't expected them to be here. As soon as Adrian noticed the Mirabelle, he immediately tugged on his mom's dress and asked her to come up to her. After greeting them, Cornelia said they were honored to have them visit that evening. The Empress stroked Mirabelle's head and said she was very glad to see her again, and then she asked how Cornelia was doing, and she said she hadn't expected to see them here. After all, they must be terribly busy, and she was very grateful to them for taking the time. The Empress said she would never miss such a grand ball for Cornelia and her daughter. Mirabelle was embarrassed, for Adrian had not taken his eyes off her, and she asked why he was looking at her. He got a little nervous and said that she looked very nice today. She couldn't believe her ears, asked what he meant, and then he realized he'd said it out loud and started to say, confused, that that wasn't what he'd meant to say, and apologized again for scaring her last time, though it didn't sound like an apology to Mirabelle. But she understood why he did it. Even though he himself had fallen then, she smiled and said it was okay. Thanking him for his apology, he became very nervous, and lowering his head to the floor, asked her if she wanted to be his friend. Cornelia, hearing this, leaned over to her daughter and said that Prince Adrian seemed to want to be friends with Mirabelle. She wondered what a friend he would offer friendship for. But at least he was an honest kid who cared a lot for his mother. He was like a charming little brother to her, and she answered him that she would agree to be friends with him. They shook hands, and Adrian said that from that day on, they were friends. She had never crossed paths with him in the past, so she hadn't realized he had such an attractive side. The prince took advantage of the moment and asked Mirabelle to dance with him. She was a little puzzled, even though she knew that everyone danced at the ball. She could not expect to dance with Prince Adrian. To her, it was like dancing with her younger brother. But she figured there was nothing wrong with it, and maybe it would even be fun. Besides, she couldn't say no while the Empress was watching. She told him it sounded lovely, but asked him to request her to dance formally. He was a little surprised, but immediately got down on one knee, held out his hand and said, "Beautiful lady, would you please honor me with a dance of your own?" Though it was far from perfect, she thought he had pulled it off and agreed, saying she would be honored. Then they began to dance. Adrian looked so scared for her, but danced perfectly for such a person. Even though it wasn't a perfect dance, she wasn't a very good dancer either. As Prince Adrian suddenly stumbled and fell, she managed to grab him by the waist and prevented him from landing on the ground. He thanked her for her help, but he was very ashamed of it. When Mirabelle realized this, she thanked him for the dance, saying it was great so as not to upset the boy. She assured him that there was nothing to worry about, and she liked everything about it. When they thanked each other for the dance, people began to discuss them, saying that they would make a wonderful couple, thinking that they could change the whole relationship between the great throne and the duchy. Someone began to discuss their wedding. Mirabelle, hearing all these rumors, began to feel strange. None of these people had any idea of the age difference between Mirabelle and this child. Not the kind of score I was hoping for. Elliot suddenly called out to her, praising her for her dance. After all, she'd only had a few days to get the hang of it, and she'd done a great job. Elliot approached with a beautiful lady. She immediately introduced herself as the daughter of the Earl of Embro Sofrano. Mirabelle realized that this was the girl Elliot was in love with. "I had the pleasure of meeting her," she said. "She seemed so beautiful. It was no wonder Elliot was in love with her. She felt like the scent of lilies was thinning on her." That's when she realized what was coming at her, and she wanted to tease him even more, so she suggested a dance. She told them that she and the prince had already done the dance, and it was their turn. Elliot was very panicked, trying to find an excuse, and then Mirabelle asked him if he could dance. He turned around and asked Zenial if she would dance with him, to which she happily agreed. Mirabelle had noticed that even Elliot, who was so powerful and confident, would freeze up in situations like this. Taking advantage of the moment, Adrian asked Mirabelle if he could be her date for the rest of the evening. He had heard that this was Mirabelle's first ball, so as her friend he wanted to teach her the basics. She happily agreed. The ball went on much longer than she had expected. Her companion fell asleep and was carried away in the arms of a guard. Her little one talked endlessly with the Empress, so she decided not to tire herself out and quietly slipped out of this ball. She went out to get some air, but noticing the beauty of the garden, she thought she was in a fairy tale and decided to walk around it a bit. Suddenly the bushes stirred, and it seemed to her that someone was sitting there. She took the stick in her hand, thinking that she might be attacked before she could call the guards, and decided to walk over and see what was there. Already swinging it, she heard a request to stop as Jeffrey suddenly came out of there. She was greatly surprised when she asked him what he was doing here. He told her that he had come here to see her, for people had told him that he could find her here. He thought he would have to wait for ages before he could find her, but he was lucky, and she came out into the garden. He was glad to see her, for they had not seen each other for a long time. She said he had been foolish, for if she had been a guard, she could have punished him severely, and that made it all the more difficult. He said he hadn't even thought about it, and smiled sweetly. She'd realized in the wagon that he was reckless, of course, but she was finally convinced now. Then Jeffrey said that as soon as he heard that the Grand Duke was giving a grand ball, he decided to come, as he hoped to see her here, and held out a bouquet of flowers to her. Said he'd bought them for her. She liked the flowers very much and thanked him for them, but she wondered whether he had come all this way just to give them to her. He told her that although he had not yet paid her for the potatoes, he wanted to do it for her. She thanked him again for the bouquet and pinned it on her dress so she wouldn't lose it. Then she asked him to be more careful next time, telling him that he needed to protect himself. She noticed that he was getting more scars on him and asked where they came from, to which he told her it was nothing. And then she thought she might be able to heal him with divine power and asked him to come closer to see them. But he said it was okay. She turned away from him, saying that if he didn't want her to, she wouldn't do it. Then Jeffrey got really nervous, grabbed her and pulled her closer, saying that if she wanted to watch, let her watch. But he said it too loudly, and she was afraid someone might see them. Immediately she covered his mouth and looked around, but everything seemed to be fine. When she asked why Jeffrey was so hot, maybe he had a cold, to which he told her it was fine and suggested she focus on his wounds. She motioned for him to stand still, beginning to examine the wounds. She didn't like the look of them. She leaned her hand on the scar and began to think about how she could use the divine power, trying to remember the priest's words, when suddenly she heard Vivre's voice, who told her to concentrate the divine power at her fingertips. He told her that it would be very easy for her, for she was his chosen one. Then suddenly her hand glowed, and the scars began to heal. Jeffrey was surprised, for his face no longer hurt, nor did the rest of his body. She was glad that he was healed, but she had to be careful, because he was still a child, and if he started asking a million questions, everything would go wrong. So she asked him to keep it a secret, and he promised not to tell anyone. Now that that was over with, she asked him again why he had come. Was he really willing to pay 2 potatoes? He scratched his head and said he had come here for another reason and had forgotten all about the potatoes. She said it was okay, he shouldn't worry about those potatoes, and suggested he go somewhere else to continue the conversation, saying she knew where to sit down around here. They went to the fountain, where she asked him once more why he had come. For she really wondered, for he had taken a great risk to get here. So the reason was very serious. He said he wanted to thank her because he had heard that the Grand Duke had withdrawn the reward for him, and had even paid his debt to Gaiman. It was not clear to him why he showed him such kindness. And then he resolved to make several visits at once to Critten's houses. Eventually he confronted the Grand Duke. He asked him a question. Why is he helping him? And the Duke said he was doing it for his granddaughter. And once he realized his situation, he took pity and decided to help. Mirabelle asked her grandfather to cancel the reward for Jeffrey, but she didn't even realize he was also getting out of debt. Jeffrey said he wondered who the granddaughter was, and then he saw her a few days ago in a carriage at the Crichton mansion on her way to the temple. Even though Mirabelle had introduced herself as Mirabelle Hale, he hadn't realized she was actually Crichton. But after weighing it all again, he realized there was no one else he could ask for help but her. And Mirabelle's story of traveling to the capital to meet her grandfather, the story of Duke Crichton's long-awaited union with his daughter and granddaughter 10 years later, only confirmed his guesses. Mirabelle told him that he was right, and she was the one who asked his grandfather to take his award off, because he didn't deserve it. Jeffrey was very worried, for he didn't even know how to thank her for that. Even the potato she gave him was already a divine blessing. She told him everything was fine and a simple "thank you" would suffice. She was nice to him at first, because she knows that one day, but she also knows what it's like to fight for your life alone as an orphan. It's brutal and painful and scary, and Jeffrey has spent his whole life trying to stay strong. He continued to hold back the tears that were bursting out, breathing heavily in her arms. He was finally able to speak, apologizing for it, thanking her again. She told him that if he felt sad again, he should not hold back his tears, and handed him a handkerchief. Jeffrey asked if he could keep it, to which she smiled and said it was his now. Jeffrey noticed the look in Mirabelle's eyes, and asked why she was looking at him like that. Because she had already said that he could keep the handkerchief, and there was no turning back. She smiled, and said that she wasn't thinking about that at all. She just liked his hair, it was very pretty. Not expecting to hear that, he asked her menacingly what she was talking about, which made her laugh a lot. Then he got mad that she was making fun of him, But she said that she just thought he was adorable and she wasn't making fun of him, and that that's what she meant about his hair. He asked if she really liked their color, and she touched them and said they shimmered in the moonlight like silver, very beautiful and unusual. He got embarrassed and turned to her and said she was very beautiful too. She asked him what he meant, since her hair was just a plain color, and he said she was beautiful in everything because she was her. She was sure he was only saying that because he was grateful to her, but it still felt good, and she thanked him for it. Then she asked if he would like to stay with her, or rather, in this mansion. After all, he was supposed to become a mercenary king one day, but until then, his world would surely be filled with hardship and sadness. And she suggested him to stay in the mansion because she feels that he would be much more trained in swordsmanship here. It wasn't just that, however. He was only 11, and she didn't want him to face such avoidable difficulties. She said she would put in a good word for him if he decided to stay, and he would be trained here to be a knight. He thanked her for the offer, but said he was happy with everything. She asked him why he didn't want to stay, since he would be better off here. He stood up and said he did what he had to do. And besides, he didn't want to be indebted to her anymore. After all, first there were the potatoes, then the reward, and even his remaining debts. And how dare he get anything more from her if he gives nothing in return? She smiled and told him not to think it was another duty. But he said he could handle it himself, and she had nothing to worry about, that he was only 11 and already so independent. And then she asked him again. He said it was the last time she would offer. But he said no again. But he said there was something she could do for him, and asked her from time to time he could do it no problem, but asked him to make an appointment next time. After all, if he was caught sneaking into the noble's territory, things could end badly, and he said he understood her. Then they heard someone walking around the garden looking for Mirabelle. Most likely it was her mother, and they decided it was time for them to go. Jeffrey said that he could take care of himself, and asked not to worry about Mirabelle. He told her he was leaving for Karen tonight. The Merchants Guild was heading there, and he intended to go there. She was going to ask him to stay, at least for the night. But she realized it was pointless, because if he had plans, he would go to carry them out. So she smiled and told him to come to her whenever he wanted, but to talk about it in advance. He smiled and told her not to be angry with him for coming too often, to which she told him she would be glad. He turned around and headed for the field. She asked why he didn't go out the main gate, and he promised that he would use it the next time he had the proper invitation, but for now he had to run. As he ran away, he mentally thanked her again, promising that he would be much better the next time they saw each other. After the ball, the Grand Duchess returned to her usual daily routine. However, there were small changes in Mirabelle's life, but the biggest one was her morning training. After 2 dreary long weeks of endurance training, Uncle Brian finally handed her a wooden sword. Even though the lessons became much more difficult, she was very happy that she was learning from such a master who was able to reach such heights. And that was the biggest reward for her, to endure all these difficulties, and she was even happy with such intense training. She was beginning to like the idea of becoming a knight, and getting a title of nobility more and more. After all, her teacher said that a noblewoman was usually doomed to live the rest of her life as someone's wife. And considering the possible prospects that awaited Mirabelle after the successful defense of the Grand Duchy, it turned out to be a good choice for her. Sitting at the dinner table, her mother asked if Mirabelle had gone to practice today, to which she shared the good news that she had finally been given a sword to hold. Her mom then asked her not to overexert herself and to take breaks during class. Uncle Brian, hearing this, asked what breaks were involved, and apparently, Cornelia has no idea what an incredible talent her daughter has for sword fighting. And it only took a day to learn some of the techniques that Elliot had been trying to master for days. He was very proud of her, and Cornelia thought that perhaps Mirabelle was taking an example from Gale, and was glad of that. But then Danielle decided to jump into the conversation and reminded her that she's still a little girl. And even though she's so good, she can get hurt. She may be able to heal wounds and injuries with her divine power, but she's better off not getting them at all. Everyone was really worried about Mirabelle's safety, but wanted to support her in whatever choices she made. And then Uncle Daniel asked Cornelia if she was interested in anyone at the ball. He realizes that she may still have feelings for Gale, but it upsets him that she is alone after all these years. She thanked her uncle for his concern and said she had no intention of dating anyone else. Belle needed her. At that moment, Mirabelle realized what the ball was for. Her uncle was trying to sell not only her, but her mother as well. And then she decided to ask directly, standing up from the table. She said that she seemed very anxious that she and her mother should marry. The Duke asked what this was about, and then Mirabelle said that her uncle had told her that the Marquis of Bayev had a 16-year-old son who would make a good match for her. Daniel said that this marriage would further strengthen the influence of House Crichton. Here Daniel got a little confused and said that the son of the Marquis of Bayev was an exceptionally young man. He only mentioned him as a potential possibility. But Mirabelle continued to list the names Daniel had mentioned. And when it came to Duke George, the Grand Duke got very angry with Daniel, tried to explain that he meant that George could help them find a good man for Mirabelle, and that she had misunderstood him. But Elliot decided to jump into the conversation and said that he had clearly heard that day when Danielle was naming potential candidates for her. Daniel decided to look hurt and said it broke his heart to think that his own nephews thought so poorly of him. The Duke said that whatever Daniel's intentions were, he should avoid such talk in the presence of the children. He had no intention of forcing the marriage on Cornelia or any of the children, and apologized to them for Daniel, explaining that he must have misspoken, causing them to think falsely that he had intent. Elliot apologized, saying that he must have made a mistake, and the Duke said that if Danielle ever brought up such a conversation in front of the children again, he would have no choice but to intervene. But then Daniel said that he was only saying it out of love for them, and promised to avoid any further misunderstandings. Mirabelle was happy with this arrangement, understood her point of view, and Daniel will not be able to do anything more to her mother. Besides, Elliot might be on her side in the future and could help her. Mirabelle caught up with Elliot outside, asking the servants to leave them alone, for there was something they wanted to discuss. So she grabbed him and asked him what he thought of his great-uncle Daniel. This puzzled him, and he warned her that if she called him that and it was overheard by anyone, she could get in big trouble, and she promised to be careful. But she asked him how he felt about him anyway, to which he said that she knew perfectly well that he was a bad man. But why did she suddenly decide to ask him that? She said it was a very long story and she would try to tell it soon. Said that up until they came here, they used to send Grandpa letters, but someone would intercept them so Grandpa could never see them. Elliot had heard that Auntie had sent letters to his grandfather asking for forgiveness, and asked if these letters were the ones Mirabelle was talking about, to which she said that they were. He said these letters were sent through travelers and someone else, and maybe someone lost them along the way. It's not uncommon. Said she understood that, but explained that Mom wrote at least 2 letters every week, and that if any of those letters had reached Grandpa, they would have been reunited much sooner. However, none of them made it to the mansion, and that they entrusted the letters to different mercenaries and traders each time, and they all managed to get lost. Mirabelle asked him if he thought it was a coincidence. She said it sounded rather odd, and if she'd been sending letters for years and none of them had gotten through, he thought someone had been intercepting those letters from the mansion. Mirabelle thought that someone wanted to prevent her mother from returning to the house, but Elliot assured her that if that were the case, Duke Crichton would have already taken care of the matter, to which Mirabelle said that she had already spoken to her grandfather about it. But since they were already reunited with her mother, he didn't think anyone would do such a thing. Elliot said he understood everything, but he wondered if Uncle Daniel had anything to do with it, or if Mirabelle suspected him. Thinking it was he who had stolen the letters, she answered him that she did, though she knew it was far from a suspicion, and in future she herself had made sure with her own eyes when he told her, explained why he had done so, but only she knew about it, or she couldn't be sure he'd believe her even if he knew the details. But if Danielle found out, her plans would be ruined. So Elliot asked her if what she was saying was true. Why would a great-uncle do something like that? Because he wouldn't do something like that without a reason. And then Mirabelle said that maybe there was a relationship with the throne. Explained that when her mother broke off her engagement to James, the ties between House Crichton and the throne were severely compromised. But that's not the case now. And asked if Elliot knew what she meant. When they returned to the mansion, the mother visited the emperor in person and begged his pardon, after which the empress and the prince attended a banquet. Elliot then remembered that Mirabelle had even befriended the prince, and Mirabelle had said that now that their connection to the throne was restored, if something terrible happened to House Crichton, they could count on the support of the throne. Then Elliot asked what she meant. Was Uncle really going to do something terrible to their house? And he said that it wasn't just Grandpa protecting their home, but also his father, Brian, and that as long as he was here, nothing terrible would happen. Mirabelle, of course, understood that Uncle Brian was capable of fending off any threat, even from Daniel. But in the future he wasn't there when everything fell apart. There's no way of knowing what happened between now and then. But it's likely Daniel devised his plan when he found out Brian's uncle wouldn't be around to stop him. Then she told Elliot that they knew Uncle Brian would be able to protect them. But they could use a little investigation and suggested that he find out who might have stolen those letters. And if they didn't find them, they could be sure that no one in the mansion was trying to stop them. Elliot agreed with her, saying that if someone did intercept your letters, they should definitely find out who. That's when she said she really needed him because she didn't know the people who worked at the mansion and what they did, and it would be very helpful if he could narrow down the list of people who might be involved. He promised to help her find out who might have received the letter, and to be sure to let her know when he had finished the list. She thanked him for his help. She was sure he would agree. Mirabelle realized that after they found the evidence, they would need an adult who could interrogate potential suspects. Elliot, seeing her hesitation, told her that she had no idea how dark and tense the mansion had been until she and her aunt returned. He'd also heard that it hadn't always been like this, at least not while his mom had been around. But when she died, he'd been about as old as Mirabelle, and it had gotten stuffy being in the mansion ever since. Now that he and his aunt had moved in, however, he was finally starting to feel at home here again, and he hadn't laughed like that in a long time. Mirabelle then returned indoors. As she found through the corridors, she was approached by the dragon, told it was time to tell his story, and asked if she was ready to hear. She had to send the maid to get some juice so she wouldn't be in the way. But the dragon said she didn't have to speak aloud for him to hear her, after all. While she wore the pendant, he could hear her subconscious. Their minds connected. He suggested trying to think about what she wanted to say. As soon as she thought of something, the dragon immediately spoke the phrase, and it surprised her very much. She couldn't believe that they were talking to each other with the power of thought. We were amused by the dragon. After all, everyone reacts the same way. But suddenly she tripped on the steps, and the dragon told the priestess to be careful. She wondered why he had called her that, and asked him to explain. To which he said that as long as they were bound by the same power, she would remain a priestess. Then the dragon said it was time to discuss the black dragon in more detail and asked to be taken to the temple of the goddess Duana, and that the local priests already considered her theirs. She asked what exactly he wanted to tell her about the black dragon, but the dragon said he would answer any questions once they arrived at the temple. It would also be best if she could discuss it with the other people in the temple. When she realized that she would have to go to the temple, she decided to do it another day. After all, she had a class today, and she was going to go there as soon as she got the chance. The next day, sitting in the carriage, she asked the wyvern if he remembered Pleon dying as soon as he handed her the pendant. To which he replied that he remembered everything, for he was a dragon guardian, untouched by blessing unlike humans, and everything he had ever experienced was invariably stored in his memory. She said that in the future where she came from he was supposed to be a saint, but time turned back and she and Pleon gave her this pendant. So what if, according to the wyvern, she is a priestess? What is Pleon's fate? The dragon assured her that she had nothing to worry about, and that Pleon had always been a loyal servant of the goddess Duana, and that being appointed a saint was a great honor, even though it was in a different timeline. It turns out that Pleon remembered everything that happened to him in his past life, even though he should have forgotten everything. But the goddess blessed him and left him with the memories of that fateful day when they failed miserably to overpower the clip. When they arrived at the temple, they were met by Lionel. He was the priest of the temple of the goddess Dwani. He said that they were waiting for her, and the archbishop and other priests were already waiting in the assembly room and asked to see her off. She accepted it as an honor and asked to be called simply Mirabelle. She had never been so formally welcomed into the temple before. Everyone seemed to recognize that she had accepted Vivre's proposal, walked up to the door and was told again that she could only go in there alone, no servants. This scared her a lot, and they asked if that was what she wanted, to which she said it was fine, they had nothing to worry about. Entering behind those mysterious doors, she was met by the archbishop and the other priests who greeted her. The archbishop touched her forehead, reciting a prayer, after which she was immediately relieved, as if she had been kissed by a goddess. As soon as they began the dialogue, the archbishop thanked Mirabelle for accepting the offer, which he thought was very hard. Normally they would present a new priestess to the world through a public ceremony, but given the circumstances, they had to forego the formalities. Mirabelle said she wasn't really interested in that, and had come here to discuss the details and particulars she needed to know, and asked to start right away. Then the archbishop began to tell her that there are those who are trying to break the seal of the clip, namely Uncle Daniel Caraton. He asked if Mirabelle had heard this from Vivre. After a positive answer, he began to tell her that what they had to fight were the forces that Daniel Triton had gathered while in the service of the Black Dragon, and that they were currently searching for traces of these agents, but they were moving very stealthily, so it was very difficult to track their leader. But now they know who it is, and most likely he himself possesses the guard stone in which the Black Dragon is sealed, and they must either stop Daniel, take the stone from him, or kill him. Then Pleon from this time said that the future him could not discover any information, except that the leader was Daniel, and they had failed. Therefore, the clip was at large. But thanks to Weaver, they were able to turn back time, and they were able to find a more worthy candidate, namely Lady Mirabelle. Looking at him, Mirabelle realized that he was suffering from his defeat, and he needed to accept it and give this mission. It must be very hard for her. Then the bracelet glowed that he really wished he hadn't tied himself up like that, and Mirabelle decided to relay those words to Pleon. He thanked her for that, but said they would discuss the details later, for now they needed to discuss the events that would begin to unfold from now on. One of the priests suggested reporting everything to the throne, but they immediately rejected the idea. After all, Daniel has a great title, and because of that, there could be very big problems, as he has a great weight in the society, and also the events that will happen in the future, which they experienced, only they know, and only they will realize it, even though they couldn't see the answer now. But they had to bide their time and keep looking for it. When Mirabelle said that Danielle would not attack until 14 years from now, and after that, the rebirth of the clips would happen. In the meantime, they should keep an eye on Daniel and prepare for all contingencies, and that if there was really no way to stop his plan from going ahead, she should be the one to kill him as a last resort. She told them that she had a sword forged from dragon bone, and then Pleon said that the sword could indeed allow her to go up against Daniel, but to kill him, she would need not only the blade, but also superior skills in wielding it. She remembered that she had been killed by Daniel's soldiers in the past, and it was the skills that she lacked that time, meaning that she needed to become even stronger than in the past. After all, this sword isn't just a sword. She rushed to reassure the priests, saying that she realized her skills weren't good enough right now, but she was only 9 years old and could get stronger and was already working on it, and that perhaps if she became as strong as the man dubbed the Mercenary King, it would appease them all. They asked if it was about Jeffrey, to which she said she planned to become stronger than him. They wished her luck, and told her that if anything went wrong, they would get him on their side, so they asked her not to aggravate herself. She decided that the next time she saw Jeffrey, she had to build a relationship with him. she decided that the next time she saw Jeffrey, she should make a good connection with him. Deciding to end at this meeting, Pleon turned to Mirabelle, saying that if she needed help, she could come to him at any time. When she arrived at this temple, she thanked him, smiled, and said that she already needed help. She apologized for bothering him, but he believed there was nothing wrong with that. Knowing how to control divine powers would be a huge plus on her path, and they had wanted to offer it to her for a long time. Mirabelle decided that when it came to her mom's recovery, she'd be glad if it happened as soon as possible, and she could use the skills. Then the dragon said that if Mirabelle learned how to control divine power, it would give more freedom to him, and he was looking forward to it. She asked if that freedom would be the same as breaking the seal of the clipboard, and the dragon reassured her, told her that by freedom, he meant traveling outside of Kulon, for only his soul was locked up here, while his body slumbered somewhere deep in the being of the universe, and that his seal should not be broken until someone found his body. He said that once she has her powers, she can extract him from this pendant and materialize his soul, and then they wouldn't have to communicate through this artifact. It sounded very tempting to her, and besides, a grown lady wouldn't be able to walk around with such a childish pendant. When she got to the building, the priest said that for her next class she should come here, in this place, quietly concentrating on her powers, and suggested she start now, asking her to show her palms. He said she would feel something at her fingertips, and asked her to memorize the sensation. A ball of light appeared in her hands, filled with the power of energy. She had felt it before, the same warmth and power she had felt when she had healed Jeffrey's wounds. Then the priest lowered his hands and asked her to try on her own, saying it might take a long time, but it was worth a try. When she tried to concentrate, the dragon interrupted her, telling her not to try to find anything else in the energy. She realized then that her energy was divine power, and she shouldn't look for anything else in it. Then she told the priest that she was able to find it, and spun it around her hands into a golden ball of energy. Everyone was surprised to learn so quickly, but she wanted to feel even more power and overdid it, giving off an energy that burst her orb and tossed her aside. The priest was very surprised, for he had never seen such a thing before. He said that it was only possible in theory. The power was so strong that it exploded. He said he thought she had done well on her first assignment, and they would learn how to control these powers in the next lesson, and gave her the crystal ball. It was the same one from the room where Pleon had first spoken to her. The priest had told her that crystal could hold divine powers, and that was how they were able to meet Pleon that day. Though a crystal of that size shouldn't do such incredible things, it would definitely help Mirabelle contain its immense power. She took it and promised to handle it very carefully. Pleon met them after class, and they had much to discuss. Mirabelle asked him to get her ready for the carriage. When everyone left, Pleon said that he was terribly worried that his death after handing over Coulomb might have shocked Mirabelle. She smiled and said she'd be fooling him if she told him she wasn't the least bit surprised, but she thought there was a good reason. Pleon then said that the pendant was a sacred artifact, and only saints could touch it. So the only option to get it to Mirabelle was for him from the future to contact her through divine power and the crystal room. Pleon expressed his joy that he had kept his memories of the future, because he was sure she might be very confused about what had happened. But since he had explained everything to her, it should have been clearer. Mirabelle asked him not to worry and told him that this time they would serve as priests, not saints, and would be able to stop the Clipper rebirth together. When she arrived home, she was about to rest, but noticed that there was a boy sitting on the doorstep. When she looked more closely, she realized it was Adrian. Then she asked him what he was doing here, to which he replied that Her Majesty had come to visit Mirabelle's mother, and he was just accompanying her. But he also came to visit his friend, and asked her again if they were friends. She hadn't expected him to be so sociable, and invited him to her room, asking him to bring them drinks. Adrian asked her where she had been all day, because he had been waiting for her since morning. She answered him with a smile that she was at the Dwani temple, and then the guy started asking her endlessly what she was doing there. When she said she had gone there on business, he started asking what kind of business. Mirabelle assumed kids his age were interested in everything, but this seemed over the top to her. When she asked Adrian if her uncle teaches him too, he said yes. He always wants to learn something more because it's not as boring as other classes. Then she decided to say that she was also learning from him. He was very surprised, because he hadn't even thought about it. But unlike them, she was just beginning her training. And then Adrian offered to spar with her, because among children his age only Elliot could hold a sword. But he was too strong an opponent for him. She smiled and told him that he might regret the offer, for she was sure she would win it. She was sure he'd have a chance if she were a little girl his age. But inside that body lived a former mercenary. Then Adrian asked if there was a sparring hall on the estate, took her hand and asked her to take him there. Upon arriving at the gym, Brian didn't want to put them sparring, as Mirabelle had only held the sword for 3 days. Lyot offered his candidacy in her place. Then Adrian said that Mirabelle had already agreed. Lyot asked her in surprise if that was true, to which she told him that it would be a great opportunity for her. Mirabelle asked Uncle Brian to be the judge of their duel. Her uncle was very nervous, saying that even though Mirabelle was older, Adrian had held a sword for 3 years, unlike her, and he was very worried that she might get hurt. She tried to reassure him by telling him that he would watch them, and she was sure everything would go well. Brian agreed to spar, but asked them both to be careful not to hurt each other. They looked at each other and made that promise. Before the sparring started, Adrian said he wouldn't spare her, even though they were friends. She was glad to hear this, and told him that he would be very much dishonored if he lost this fight. Before the sparring began, Brian announced the rules, and the finale of this sparring would be when one side gave up or could not continue the fight. But also in case of serious injuries, he promised to intervene. As soon as the sparring began, Mirabelle immediately began to analyze her opponent, noticing that he too was studying every move. But his posture was unsteady, and he looked too nervous to allow her to strike. From her experience, people in this state tend to react instinctively, not fully understanding their opponent's intentions. She realized that these were her chances, and lunged right at him, running sharply. She realized he was going to swing, and in that second, she was able to crouch down and knock the sword out of him. Bowing her dream to his head, she laughed and said she had won, suggesting Adrian surrender. But Adrian wasn't too upset about the defeat. On the contrary, he was happy. He was surprised that Mirabelle was so strong. Mirabelle wondered why her uncle hadn't said anything to her, since he was the most concerned. Then he leaned over to her and asked if she could take another round. When she answered in the affirmative, he told Elliot to bring his sword. Elliot was greatly concerned, for she was only 9 years old, and he was afraid of hurting her. He also thought that Mirabelle had almost fallen during the fight, but she noticed that her uncle realized it was a special deceptive maneuver. Mirabelle realized that this duel would tell her her level, for Elliot was the strongest of the boys his age. When the bout started, Mirabelle noticed that he wasn't too excited about this fight, but she could understand him. Even though this was a great opportunity for her, she badly needed to take her skill to the next level. She was going to do her best to get her uncle to reconsider her status. The first move was Mirabelle's. She swung with all her might, but Elliot was able to fend her off. She knew he wasn't going to give up much. Pushing him hard with her shoulder, she tossed him aside, much to his surprise. After all, he was sure that she was just a beginner. After that, the fight took on a different character. It was already a battle of honor for Elliot, and he swung sharply at her from above, but she was able to fend him off. Realizing that there was no point in using physical force now, she dodged sharply and snatched his sword from his hands. Brian declared her victory, but she said she won by pure luck. After all, if they had fought seriously, she would have lost. Elliot didn't even expect her to be able to wrestle the sword from him.